I neglected to tell you there's a restroom out there and to the right, and I know we're going to probably just go straight through, so if you need to do it, go ahead. There's that was bad. That was a bad idiom. There's also, food and wine. I'm going to say something about that in a second. Oops, I brought the wrong paper. So next, we're going to have Terry and Nancy, Terry Arrett and Nancy Morales, speak together and talk about this book, which is the second volume of Plagios, or Plagiarisms, translations of the poetry of Ulalume González de León. And 16 Rivers put out the first version of it, the first volume, which did win the Northern California Book Award for translation last year, right? Last year. So this is number 2. I don't know if the award will come again, but it's a beautiful book. It's really a beautiful book, and the poetry is beautiful. And I want to say something about the poet and translator, or translators. So Terry Arrett is, as I said before, one of the founders of 16 Rivers Press, and she's really a pillar of the press. I can say that from experience. We always count on Terry, and she probably doesn't like it, but we do, and she comes through, and so thank you. She also has published a number of poetry collections, including Lost Body and Translations from the Human Language, which was, I don't know how my writing, one of them was part of the National Poetry Series. Lost Body. And that's a pretty prestigious thing to be a part of, if you know about that. She has won the Commonwealth Club of California Book Award and the Nimrod Hardman Pablo Neruda Poetry Prize. Her initial translation work on the poetry of Ulalume, well, I told you this, won the Northern California Book Award. Lucky Break is her third book of poems. And so that's Terry. And then working with her is Nancy Morales, first generation American of Puerto Rican parents, has degrees from Rutgers, Delphi, Teachers College at Columbia, currently board member for the Northern California chapter of the Fulbright Alumni Association. She teaches Spanish to private clients and is co-translator of Plagios. She also is a winemaker. She and her husband are winemakers, and if you like wine, you should try the Nicholson Ranch wine back there. The Pinot Noir is really something. So she brought that to share with all of you, and thank you, Nancy, for that. I will turn it over to them.
Trying to turn on the fireplace.
Oh, sure. Yes, of course. So thank you all for being here. It's quite an honor to be at this table with my fellow poets and translators. I'm like Brenda, I've written out my notes so that I don't stray, and I want to be able to turn the podium over to my co-translator, Nancy, with plenty of time for the remarks that she wanted to make. The first point I wanted, when asked to talk about the joys and challenges of translating, is that translating, whether you're doing it for yourself, which is what I was doing initially, or for other people, it's what breaks us out of our monolingual culture. And that monolingual quality to our culture has tremendous limitations on our thought and our cultural assumptions. So that's the most important, for me, benefit of engaging in translation. As a poet, there are some other important ramifications of translating poetry, and that's that it takes me down deep into the very elements of language. I've always felt that my native language is nonverbal, probably closer to dreaming, and that when I try to find the words in English, that it's an act of translation. The only time when I'm not struggling to translate is when I fall asleep and into that dream state. I want to share with you a quote from the poet Donald Hall. Some of you may know Donald Hall. He wrote an essay called The Unsayable Said, and this is a quote from that. The unsayable builds a secret room in the best poems, which shows in the excess of feeling over paraphrase. This room is not a, quote, hidden meaning to be paraphrased by the intellect. It conceals itself from reasonable explanation. The secret room is something to acknowledge, accept, and honor in a silence of assent. The secret room is where the unsayable gathers, and it is poetry's uniqueness. This idea of the unsayable essence of a poem is also reflected in this short poem by Ulalume González de León. It's called Palabra. I'll read it in English, and then Nancy will read it to you in the original Spanish. Word, spoken word, so alone, so naked. Go back to wearing the unsayable.
Palabra, pronunciada palabra, tan sola, tan desnuda. Regrésate a vestirte de indecible.
Translating from any language first requires an encounter with the poem beneath the poem beneath the language, the unsayable. And then building an English poem that also has room for the unsayable to gather. My earliest experiences with translation were from Latin, translating Virgil's Aeneid, and Italian, translating the poetry of Eugenio Montale. But I also experimented with a technique called homophonic translation, which attempts to find English equivalents for the sounds of words in an unfamiliar language. After reading my mistranslations, as I called them, of Jacques Prévert, my husband, who speaks French, commented that my versions got everything wrong except the tone. I began to think that a poem's emotional tone might be closely related to the sounds of the words. This level of meaning is very profound, though mostly unconscious, and in translating, it's important to keep some faith with the poem's music, the poem beneath the words, so to speak. This is one key to unlocking the secret room where the unsayable gathers. Ulalume González de León's poetry presents particular challenges. One is that she is very abstract. She was a student of philosophy at the Sorbonne. She originally from Uruguay, from Montevideo, became a Mexican national, and considered herself a Mexican poet. But she did study in Paris at the Sorbonne, and she was studying philosophy. So there's a strong element of that abstraction in her work. There's also something very ephemeral about her poetry. It's really, really difficult to paraphrase, so a challenge to translate. Octavio Paz, with whom Ulalume worked on a couple of Mexican journals, Paz called this quality in her work, this ephemeral quality, a geometry of air. She also engages in collage or montage poems, where she uses language from other sources, sometimes in other languages. What does a translator stay faithful to when the poet has plagiarized? And then there are the differences in grammar, syntax, verb moods, tenses, genders of nouns that just exist, they're built in between English and Spanish. The one that I tend to focus on a lot is in Spanish, there's a very close connection between the sensual and the scientific or abstract or intellectual. In English, our language and its history has forced a split between those. Our intellectual language is Latinate in its origins, and our sensual language, our sort of working class language, is Anglo-Saxon or Germanic in its origins. And my inclination in translating Ulalume is to always want to render the poem in Anglo-Saxon diction as much as possible. But so often her language is deliberately abstract and scientific, and the Latin cognate is sometimes the better choice. But it's an interesting quirk of history that in English we are always going to have that split between the sensual and the intellectual. And in Spanish, as in any Romance language, that split doesn't exist. So there are many things we simply can't render in English the way it works in Spanish. And I'm going to turn things over to Nancy so she can talk a little bit about her experience with translating. I think, no, maybe.
Thank you, Terry, and good afternoon and welcome. I want to again thank 16 Rivers Press, Dominican College for this venue. Thank you so much for it. It's really beautiful. I also want to thank Elliot and Judy. And I just want to clarify, I'm not that cool in the sense that I make wine. My husband does. So, and I'm a back of the house kind of person. But yeah, he does make wine, and yeah, and I'm glad that you guys can have the opportunity to taste it. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. If he were here, he's like, really? So I'm like, yeah. Anyway, okay, so I just wanted to try to share a little bit of my thoughts on translation, the art of translation, and its joys and challenges, because I believe we're sitting here in this room with amazing people who have already presented so much, and I think that's pretty amazing for me to even hear that too. So I would want to approach it, and I am approaching it by sharing some words, which I use as guideposts for me, specifically how I go about the process. And words are like experience, awareness, accessibility, allowing, flow, simple and complex, open and silence. And I say that to start off because for me, when I read the Spanish, I'll speak about Ulalume González de León. When I read the Spanish, I have an experience, a very alive physical experience. It affects me very strongly. I have images, emotions, and it really affects me strongly. So immediately my process would be, okay, what is this? If I'm going to communicate to somebody in English, what is it that I'm trying to say? So I translate. I try to put some words to this experience. However, it's not complete. And I say that because at the end of the day, I'm trying to create something beautiful. There is something beautiful in the poem, the original poem. It's already intact as it's complete with its nuance, with its language, with its culture, with its words. It has a feeling, and if I left it, Ulalume's words, and Matthew, who I had never met before, came up and was so kind and generous to say that he's read our translations, and he loves it, and he was so enthusiastic. I was very touched. I'm like, oh, so you read the Spanish? And he's like, okay. So, however, I read the Spanish, and I am okay with it. I'm okay with the Spanish as it is. I find it immensely beautiful and interesting, and I'm so fascinated. And so it's kind of like if I could just stay there, I'm like, yeah. And someone like, well, what was that all about? And I'm like, oh, okay, let me get to it. And so that's translation. So I'm asking, and you're asking yourself, because most of you are here because you're big supporters, or perhaps you're translate, or you're interested in translation, or you're thinking, can I do that? And the answer is yes, you do it all the time. You're translating when you're listening to your children, when you're listening to your partners, when you're interacting with others, when you're just as simple as interacting with me. You're translating. You're hearing me or not hearing me. You're creating silence or not. I'm a living poem or I'm not. So you're with me or you're not. You're open to me. You're closed to me. You're flowing with me. You're experiencing me or you're not. And it's where you are. So you're bringing that aspect. And that's what I do. So the art of it is the beauty of that. How do I create it so it's beautiful? And beauty is in so many ways. How can I allow that to flow out? And it can be anything you want it to be. So how can you stay true to a poem? We have in this collection, we have a contract with the Mexican government, and so we have to stay true. So in the sense that they're part of their conditions is that we're very true. We don't change things up, too much. We can't stray so much, and we have a lot of footnotes to do that, to clarify. So the joys and challenges in translation, well, I'm not doing it by myself. I have a partner, so we're collaborating. Therefore, and that's super positive in the sense that I'm not alone. I can, we can kind of, this is how my take was it, and, this is my take, and like, how can we look at that, and then at the end kind of try to see what was happening and what we'd like to say. And a lot of times it's driven by context and time and situation. We can spend hours, days, months, and you're like, okay, I'm done. This is good. So, that's as simple, that's a human experience of it, so how long can we spend with it? So that is actually true. So you might get that experience and you're reading, let's say you read the original language, in our case it's Spanish. Let's say that you read Spanish, you're like, no way, how could that be? Wait, I would have said it this way. And that's the offering. So I like to say that we're offering something. We're not the final. We're not the end story. And, it can continue on. It lives and it has life. It has life as much as you put the life into it. It has life in what you give to it and what you bring to it. I was reading Stephen King, and just in this time I can add, Stephen King was saying that a writer, if you can't say that unsayable thing, then you shouldn't be writing. So, but for poetry, or for poets, the unsayable is part of it in the sense of it's the experience of housing that experience. What the thing, as Matthew was saying, that experience of, it's bigger than words can say. I'm always pointing to, like the finger pointing to the moon, but it's beyond that. So that's kind of the thing that we're trying to create. I want to illustrate that by reading some poems of this. And the first one I'm going to start with is a poem called Desiderata. And it was a poem that she plagiarized from, she didn't plagiarize as much as she took the title from, in that sense, Max Ehrmann, who wrote it in the 1920s. And he wrote this as a poem that he dedicated to his daughter, and with the intention around wishing joy and peace. Ulalume, in her version of joy and peace, is obtained by desire. And her desire eventually is in lust. So it's a little bit different in that sense. Okay, let me see. Desiderata. I'll start it in English. I desire what I don't have, not your body that I embrace. I desire your desire. I desire that you desire what you don't have, not my body that you embrace. I desire that you desire my desire. I don't desire anyone who doesn't desire my desire. I don't desire anyone who doesn't desire that I desire their desire. All right. Desiderata. Deseo lo que no tengo, no tu cuerpo que abrazo. Deseo tu deseo. Deseo que desees lo que no tienes, no mi cuerpo que abrazas. Deseo que desees mi deseo. No deseo quien no desea mi deseo. No deseo a quien no desea que yo desee su deseo. Right? Right? It is different. You have this different experience. Okay. I love that. I love this. Okay. Now, the second poem I chose is called Semantic Connections, and I chose it precisely because it describes the process of creating a poem and the magical realism experience. That is fantasy in your kind of connected with reality. Now, that was a style, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez made it very famous with Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, and many Latin Americans use it, and many have turned against it because many Latin American writers, contemporary Latin American writers, turned against it because they felt that many writers were not taking their work seriously because they just thought, oh, you're talking about a fantasy, when the plight of many people in Latin America is very serious. It's very dire. It's very distressing that it feels surreal. The reality is so grim that it is surreal. So anyway, however, she uses this style and semantic connections. Okay. Ravi, the enchanter, seated beside a basket of words, charmed them, and they arranged themselves into meanings. They obeyed the enchanter and meant exactly what he wanted them to mean. There is one who, in order to cry every day, invents sad words. Humpty Dumpty asked Alice the meaning of her name, and he laughed. So much, the corners of his mouth met at the back of his head. Compromisos semánticos. Ravi el encantador, sentado junto a una canasta de palabras, las encantó y se ordenaron en significados. Obedecían al encantador y significaban exactamente lo que él quería que significaran. Hay quien inventa palabras tristes para llorar todos los días. Humpty preguntó a Alicia qué significaba su nombre y se rió tanto que se le juntaron las comisuras a la vuelta de la cabeza. And my last one, I chose it because it's a poem that we translated, and having taught Spanish for many years and my family's speaking Spanish, if you speak Spanish, you would have said that translation is wrong. I'm being very sincere. You'd say, wow, that translation is wrong. And so I'm like, wow, and myself, I'm like, wow, that translation is different. So, and I say that because we boldly did that. And many times, that's what translators do. And you're trying, because you're charged with so much. You know, I love how Marjorie said that it's a very noble profession, a noble attempt. And I love that. That was very generous and very kind. And the intention to bring something, to render something beautiful, to share something beautiful from another language, to open someone up and present that. I think that's really wonderful. I look at this poem and I think the intention is in the right direction, and I love that you can do that. You can choose. There are many paths that are open. You choose one, and there are many others that were left unsaid or undone. And we chose this one, and I think it works, and it's beautiful. However, I always rethink it. So anyway, okay, I'm going to give you a point. Alrighty. Okay. Cansancio de toda metafísica. Yeah, I wanted to say cansancio de toda metafísica. It's tired of everything metaphysical, and the reason why I chose it again, looking at it, is because it's very simple. And I can't get on my page here. Oh, okay, aquí está. Tired of all metaphysics. Simply put, I think of sex with you. Cansancio de toda metafísica. Para simplificar, pienso en tu sexo. So, if you speak Spanish, you understand what I say. If you speak English, it's okay. It's all good. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay, we're going to have one more presenter, and then we're going to have our panel. And between our last presenter and the panel, you can get wine and really relax. And we'll see what happens in the panel. That could be very exciting, and I sure hope it is. But before we get there, we have Bob Hass. And again, needs no introduction, but I'll say books of poetry include Time and Materials. He won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. Sun Under Wood received the National Book Critics Circle Award. Praised received William Carlos Williams Award. Field Guide, that was a Yale Younger Poets Award. Right? He also co-translated several volumes of poetry with Miłosz, and is editor of the essential haiku versions of Basho, Busan, and Isai. Hope I said that right. Echo Press. He is also former poet laureate of the United States, and he's here with us. But I guess what I really want to say is thanks to Bob, I read more and more Miłosz, and the more you read that poet, who did win the Nobel Prize, the more you settle into how magnificent poetry can be. And I was doing that again, preparing for this. And then the other thing I want to say is the kind of figure that Bob has been for many of us for decades, you cannot translate. Bob Hass.
Elliot, thank you so much. I met Elliot when he was a student in my seminar at Columbia University, writing these nervy poems that were unlike the well-mannered poems that most of his classmates were writing. I have party favors here. Yeah, there are three handouts. One of them is about Ezra Pound, and one of them is about Yu Tsung Ya, and one of them is about translating an Oglala Sioux song. There's a whole shelf of books on translation theory. There are two essays that I think are the classic ones that everybody reads. One is by John Dryden in the 17th century, in which he did a lot of modernizing into the English of his time of old poetry, like Chaucer, rewriting the Wife of Bath story in what was then contemporary English. And in his introduction to his translations of Ovid, he said there are basically three kinds of translation. The first he called metaphrase, in which you do word by word translation from the other language in the word order of the original language. Or maybe you could change, the noun and the verb's position, but no more than that, word for word. the next kind he called paraphrase, which is what we more or less mean by translation. That is, a translation in which you're trying to stay as close as possible in the new language to the spirit, the form, and the content of the original. And the third he called imitation, which he did a lot of. Poems written after or in the manner of. So he would start with a line of Horace and go wherever the hell he wanted to go. And they're all, of course, perfectly legitimate ways of doing the work. The other essay is by Walter Benjamin. It's called The Task of the Translator, and its premise is that the original poem is the first bad translation of the poet's great idea. And all of the other translations are just other efforts to try to get at that poem. You're not trying to translate word by word, you're trying to translate to this other thing. So those are ways of thinking about this subject. So the things I wanted to say about my practical experience, I've translated into here and there into a lot of languages. I don't know any of them very well. I have dictionary readers knowledge with a couple of them, but I'm not fluent in any of the languages that I've worked in. Which is a different story in a way. The nearest I am to it is with when I was in college and was doing German, because I thought I was going to be a biologist, and spent a lot of time in the language lab. I was bored in the language lab, and so I started going in and memorizing Rilke poems as a way of getting a feeling for the German language. And there's a poem of his called Eingang, Initiation, that I read when I was 19 years old. It raised the hair on the back of my neck. And it begins, Ver du auch seist, whoever you are, am Abend, tritt hinaus, go outside, aus deiner Stube. Stube means lintel, if you were going to translate out past your lintel. Most of the translations say doorstep, go out over your doorstep. And the poem says, and then with your eyes, raise a tree on the horizon. Schlank, a line, slender by itself. And the next line is, und hatte die Welt gemacht. And I went, oh my God, what is that? And you have made the world. And hatte die Welt gemacht is just greater than, and you have made the world. Though you've made the world is okay, it has some of the force of that. But there is this thing of impossibility. You can imagine, another way to imagine this difference is, people have commented, George Steiner in particular, that Robert Frost in translation is really boring. And because if you translate, there is something that doesn't love a wall. It gets nothing of something there is that doesn't love a wall. It's completely a matter of you think, if you change, and the times they are a-changing, into time is altered, So one of the points I wanted to, here's another example of the kind of classic translator problem with this. The last line in the last poem in Pasternak's great book, My Sister Life, which looks back on the world of his childhood, and it rained collar studs for a century. And I had a friend in New York who had a neighbor who knew no Russian and had a neighbor who was Ukrainian, and they decided to translate My Sister Life. And they sent me the translation, and I looked at the last poem on the last line, and it said, and for a century it rained cufflinks. And I wrote to him and said, cufflinks? And he wrote back and said, we didn't think they would know what collar studs were. They don't wear them anymore. And I wrote back and said, the neck is not the wrist. But it's a choice. Translators are constantly making these kind of choices. So one of the things I wanted to say was, translation is really a matter of taste. It pretty much is a matter of, you've got to, what you love in the original poem as much as possible, you've got to bring over into the new language. And so this, as an example of this, This first handout, Yu Tsang Yuan, is probably, people have said that the greatest period of writing lyric poetry in any language ever was Tang Dynasty China. Du Fu, Li Bai, Wang Wei, Han Shan, Po Chui, Su Dongpo, little old. In that generation, there is a poet much loved in China. Everybody knows his poems, named Lu Qingyuan. And this little 4-line poem, 5 characters, 5 characters, 5 characters, 5 characters, is a poem that every Chinese school person knows. And you can imagine, 5 lines, 5 lines, 5 lines. Here are a bunch of translations. River Snow. 1,000, this is by Red Pine, the name of Bill Porter, one of the wonderful contemporary translators of Chinese, classical Chinese poetry. 1,000 mountains and not a bird flying. 10,000 paths and not a single footprint. An old man in a raincoat in his solitary boat fishes alone in the freezing river snow. Feel like you get it? You get the feel of it? Somebody wasn't satisfied. Burton Watson, another middle generation scholar. From 1,000 hills, bird flights have vanished. On 10,000 paths, human traces wiped out. Lone boat, an old man in straw cape and hat, fishing alone in the cold river snow. Which is a better translation? Third translation. Let's skip to the bottom one. Gary Snyder. I was a neighbor in the Berkeley Hills with Gary Snyder's classical Chinese teacher, a man named Edward Schaefer, who I said to him once at a party, so is there interesting work being done on classical Tang Dynasty poetry in China? And he said, no, absolutely none. He said, it's all ideological nonsense. And I said, well, what is it being done in Europe? He said, no, not really. And I thought about it and said, so are you the only person in the world who's doing good work in Tang Dynasty poetry? He said, I'm afraid so. And I asked him if it was true that Gary Snyder had been his student. And he said, yes, he was a very good intermediate student of Chinese. So this is Gary's River Snow. These 1,000 peaks cut off the flight of birds. On all the trails, human tracks are gone. A single boat, coat, hat, an old man alone fishing chilled river snow. You can see that he's trying to do something with the way the Chinese characters are disposed in that third line. A single boat, coat, hat, an old man. Does it work? Does it not work? Which of the... So, and then this translation of a book that's just coming out, Nathan Dalton Thornton, River Snow. No bird hovers above 1,000 hills. No footprint remains on 10,000 trails. One boat, an old man in a straw raincoat, is fishing alone among river snow. One of the interesting things about it is that the straw raincoat is a kind of classical figure in Chinese poetry that gets brought over into Japanese poetry. So the first major collection of Ranga in the Basho group is called A Straw Raincoat, the Japanese for the Chinese of that. So that has a kind of resonance. And is that, I got that right too? Yeah. So if you turn the page over, here's a recent effort by somebody trying to get away from that classic way of translating Chinese poetry. Sentence, 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 sentence. River snow. Mountains. No birds arise. Footprints. Footpaths run out of footprints. Lone boat. Straw cloak. Bamboo hat. Man seen casting cold river snow. So, which do you like? Which is the better of them? To me, it's evidence of what my experience is, which is you need at least 2 or 3 translations if you don't have the language to begin to feel like you're getting to that imaginary poem. So you can't do enough translating, was one point I wanted to make, besides the fact that in the end you're stuck with your own taste. So the Ezra Pound in Chinese Poetry page is just by way, this is around 1910, before he got hold of the Fenollosa manuscripts and actually translated the Li Bai poems from the Fenollosa notes that set the standard for. It was a moment that not only by translating image by image and laying out these sentences to an ear absolutely trained for iambic pentameter, it was creating the possibility of hearing the sound of plain English sentences laid out. It's really the beginning of modernist free verse, was the translation of Chinese poetry. He began earlier by going into the British Museum library and getting down the 19th century, early 20th century history of Chinese literature and experimented with rewriting those translations. And this is by way of suggesting to you, if you're stuck, go into the library, pick some obscure language, take down a book of the bad old translations, and see what you can do with it. So I'll just read the 2. I won't read the sound of rustling silk is stilled, with dust the marble courtyard filled, was I trying to, if you're going to make it poetry, right, you've got to translate it into English poetry, that means it's got to be metrical and rhymed. And Pound said, not right, really. The rustling of the silk is discontinued. Just really, as I remember at the time of my first reading, it was discontinued was such a surprising word to me because it's so unpoetic. The rustling of the silk is discontinued. Dust drifts over the courtyard. There's no sound of footfall. The leaves scurry into heaps and lie still. And she, the rejoicer of my heart, is beneath them, a wet leaf that clings to the threshold. He grabs that image at the end. This is the time when he's writing the essay on imagism. He takes a rather long poem, "Oh, fair white silk, fresh from the weaver's loom," and turns it into maybe the first imagist haiku. This is a courtesan saying, I'm not as young as I was and I'm not the favorite anymore. Fan piece for her imperial lord. Oh, fan of white silk, clear as frost on a grass blade, you also are laid aside. Gorgeous thing, little thing. Not a translation, an imitation in the spirit of that would be that kind. The other thing I gave you was just an example of the impossibility of translation, because it's a song by the Oglala Sioux warrior Tanaka Iyotake, Sitting Bull in English, and Sitting Bull, everyone has commented, does not capture at all in English the Lakota Sioux, which would be more like bull in repose. It's an expression of power. And when, having defeated Custer's army and fled into Canada and watched his people starve and brought them back and cut a deal with the U.S. government, Sitting Bull saw his people who lived on the plains go into a reservation in Arizona, got hired by Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, and where he got called Sitting Bull. When he went back to the reservation, and the young people started doing ghost dances to bring back the buffalo that we had slaughtered, the Army sent people out to arrest Sitting Bull because they thought he had stirred up this thing, and so they came into the house where he was living and said, "You're under arrest," and he pulled a knife out of his belt and they shot him. And when they shot him, his horse from the Wild West show, hearing a gun go off, got up on its hind legs and danced around the corral. An American story, and it goes with this story of how Sitting Bull received his identity song. I won't try. Ika size waan kon he, wana hanalea lo he, iotie keya waan. Wa'an, that word means no, but it's also, wa is the word for a bear. And bears were the wise knowers to the Oglala Sioux. So buried in this translation of the word, if you translate the word no, you lose the word bear. Also, he composed this song because on his vision quest, he went out and fasted for 3 days, and the song came to him. It was recorded by Frances Densmore, the great ethnomusicologist of the Plains Indians. She recorded this song, not as sung by him, but in 1916, sung by someone on that reservation in Arizona. And said the great thing about it is that the meadowlark was his learning creature. And so he composed this song in the descending sevenths of a meadowlark song. So if you want to get this amazing pivot story poem from American history into English, you need one to do it in the meter of a meadowlark song, and you need to introduce the idea of the wisdom of bears. And the word for word translation is head warrior know how to want, hey. Now all gone, hey. To suffer, to make, to be, know how, hey. To suffer, to make, to be, Kenneth Lincoln, the teacher of Oglala Sioux at UCLA, says means to crash against hard things is the idiom there. Here is Frances Densmore translation. A warrior I have been, now it is all over, a hard time I have. That was what Kenneth Lincoln was working with, and he did this translation. So I have been a warrior, and now it is all over, so I know to bear against hard times. The Song of Sitting Bull. Anyway, gorgeous the possibilities and impossibilities of translation. Thank you, Elliot. Thank you guys all. We're going to get to talk about this now.